The rain had stopped by the time Anne arrived. The garden still glistened, wet roses, trembling leaves, a sky the colour of old silver. She came through the gate with that same warm smile, holding a small tin of shortbread biscuits wrapped neatly in a blue ribbon. "Thought we might need something sweet," she said, laughing softly. I smiled, though my heart felt heavy that afternoon. There was something in the air, something unspoken. We sat, as we always did, in the sunroom overlooking the garden, 2 old women, 2 cups of tea, and a silence that knew more about us than words ever could. After a while, Anne looked down at her hands and whispered, "Do you ever think about him, Margaret?" My heart paused, not because I hadn't thought of him, but because I always did. Every morning, every night, even now. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think about him more than I should." Anne smiled sadly, her eyes glistening. "I suppose we both do, in our own ways." And that was how it began, the confession neither of us had ever spoken aloud, that we had both chosen the same man, and in doing so, we had both lost parts of ourselves. It was more than 50 years ago. I was 24, newly qualified as a nurse at St. Helena's Hospital, a small ivy-covered building at the edge of Bristol. The corridors always smelled faintly of antiseptic in lavender, and the windows looked out over fields that changed with the seasons. That's where I first met Thomas. He was a patient, a young soldier, wounded in the leg during training. He had the kind of charm that slipped past your guard before you even noticed. Not loud, not boastful, just warm, the kind that made you feel seen. He used to tease me for the way I'd tucked my hair under my cap too neatly. "Do they teach perfection at nursing school?" he'd say, eyes twinkling, and I'd laugh, pretending not to blush. It wasn't supposed to happen. Nurses weren't meant to fall for patients. But love doesn't read rule books. And before long, we were walking along the riverbanks on Sundays, talking about books, dreams, and the kind of future that feels endless when you're young. He called me his healer, and I, foolishly perhaps, believed I could heal every part of him. Anne joined the hospital a few months after I did. She was bright, graceful, and kind, the sort of woman who could make anyone feel lighter just by being near her. We became friends almost immediately. We'd share night shifts, laugh over lukewarm tea, and swap stories of patients who swore they saw angels at the edge of their hospital beds. I never told her about Thomas, not at first. It felt too private, too new, and besides, he had promised me we'd keep things quiet until he recovered and left the hospital. But then, one morning, I came in early and saw him, in the courtyard, talking to Anne. They were laughing, that easy, unguarded laugh you can't fake, and something in my chest shifted. Anne looked happy, and Thomas looked at her the way I thought he only looked at me. Weeks passed. He recovered, and one afternoon he told me he'd be leaving the hospital soon. "I'll write to you," he said. But I knew. Somehow I knew. The letters never came. He vanished, quietly, like the closing of a door you didn't know was open. I tried to move on. I buried myself in work, in patience, in anything that made the days blur into nights. Until a year later, I saw a wedding announcement in the paper. Thomas Reed, married to Anne Williams. My hands trembled so violently I spilled my tea. I remember sitting there, staring at their names printed side by side, and realizing the world had just rewritten my story without asking me first. Now, decades later, here we were, two women with wrinkled hands and careful smiles, finally speaking the truth. The man we both loved was long gone, but love leaves its fingerprints, even after the body is buried. Anne looked at me that day and said, "You healed him first, Margaret. I only tried to keep him alive after." And that was when I realized we weren't enemies. We were two healers who had loved a broken man in two different lifetimes. Anne took a long sip of her tea, her hands trembling slightly. The years had turned her hair white and her skin delicate, but her eyes, they still carried the same calm blue, like morning frost. "You know," she began softly, "I didn't even know about you until much later." Her words felt like stones dropped into still water, small ripples spreading through the silence. I looked at her, my breath caught somewhere between pain and pity. She continued, "When I met him, Thomas told me he'd been hurt, not just his leg, but his heart too. He said there was someone once, a nurse, but it hadn't worked out. He said she was too kind for him." She paused, smiling sadly. "I didn't know that nurse was you." The wind outside rustled the rose bushes, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I wanted to tell her everything, how he used to look at me across the ward, how I had believed every promise, how I had once waited weeks for a letter that never came. But now, what was the point? We were two old women sitting among ghosts. "I suppose we were both trying to heal him," I said, finally. Anne nodded. "Yes, and perhaps he loved us both, just in different ways." Her voice broke slightly on the word loved. She leaned back in her chair, eyes distant, as if looking at a memory only she could see. "At first, Thomas was everything I dreamed of. Charming, grateful, funny. He'd bring me flowers from the market, call me his angel. But then, after the wedding, something changed." She drew in a long breath. "He'd go quiet for days, sit by the window, staring at nothing. I'd ask what was wrong, and he'd just shake his head. One night, I found him in the attic, looking through an old box. Inside was a folded nurse's cap and a letter. It was addressed to someone named Margaret Clark." My hands froze around the teacup. "I didn't open it," Anne said. "I just knew. I didn't need to." For a long time, I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the reflection of our faces in the glass. Two women, same story, same man. "He never mentioned it again?" I asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, but he carried that silence for years, and so did I." Anne reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was steady. "I used to be angry with you, Before I even knew you, I imagined the woman who came before me, wondered what she had that I didn't. I smiled faintly, and I used to envy the woman who came after, wondering what she gave him that I couldn't. The two of us laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes only after a lifetime of grief. Then Anne said something I'll never forget. You know, Margaret, I think we were both healers, but some men can't be healed, not because they're bad, but because they don't know what to do with gentleness. Her words sank into the room like light through dust. We both sat there, watching the rain return, tiny droplets sliding down the glass. The past had lost its sharpness. It no longer cut. It only shimmered faintly, like an old photograph left in sunlight. I sometimes wonder, I said, if he ever truly loved either of us. Anne smiled, tears in her eyes. Oh, he did, Margaret, just not the way we needed to be loved. And with that, the years of quiet resentment, the questions that had lingered like ghosts, they all seemed to fade. Because maybe love isn't about who stays in the end. Maybe it's about who carries your memory with kindness. We sat together until evening, two women, two healers, sharing tea, forgiveness, and the quiet ache of everything that once was. And when Anne finally stood to leave, she turned to me at the door and said, "After all these years, Margaret, I'm glad we finally spoke. Maybe now we can both let him go." I nodded, tears on my cheeks. "Yes, my dear, it's time." The door closed gently behind her, and for the first time in half a century, my heart felt lighter. That night, after Anne left, I stayed by the fire a long while. The teapot had gone cold, the clock ticked quietly, steady, unbothered, like time itself didn't care about what hearts once broke beneath its hands. I looked at the empty chair across from me, the one Anne had just been sitting in, and I thought about how strange life is. Two women, two healers, both trying to mend the same man, and both ending up tending to their own wounds instead. I took out my old diary, the one Thomas never knew about. The leather was cracked, and its pages had yellowed like pressed flowers. I hadn't written in years, but tonight I needed to. October 12th. Anne came by today. We spoke of him. We spoke of the years, of what was taken and what was left behind. For so long, I thought love was about sacrifice, about giving more, being patient, forgiving endlessly. But perhaps love, real love, isn't about staying. It's about understanding when it's time to let go. We both tried to heal him. We both failed. Not because we were weak, but because he wasn't ready to be whole. I paused and listened to the wind moving through the garden. The rose bushes Anne and I had planted in spring brushed softly against the window, their petals trembling in the night breeze. I smiled faintly. "Still blooming," I whispered to myself. Thomas used to love those roses. He said they reminded me of me. For years after he left, I couldn't even look at them without feeling that tightness in my chest. But tonight, they just looked peaceful. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting, but finding peace in remembering. I closed my diary and leaned back in the armchair, the fire's glow softening the room. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel old or abandoned or unloved. I just felt human. Because love, even the kind that ends, leaves something behind, something that shapes you, even when it breaks you. Thomas taught me that, and Anne reminded me. We both chose him once, but tonight we chose ourselves. I thought of Anne's face as she left, the faint smile, the tears she tried to hide. Somehow I knew she'd go home and sleep better than she had in years. And maybe that was the point of it all. Not who won, not who was chosen, but who finally found peace. Before going to bed, I opened the drawer of the old writing desk. Inside was a small, unopened envelope, yellow with age. The handwriting on it was his. For Margaret, it said. I had found it years ago, tucked behind the wardrobe, but I never dared open it. Until tonight. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the brittle paper. Inside, only a few words. You were my calm, my cure. My mistake was thinking I deserved you. ... T. I sat there for a long time, tears spilling freely, not from anger, but release. All those years I'd wondered if he ever thought of me, and now I knew he had. Perhaps too late, but he had. I folded the letter back, placed it inside the diary, and whispered, "Goodbye, Thomas." Morning came softly, pale light seeping through the curtains. I brewed tea, just for one, and sat by the window as birds began their song. In the reflection of the glass, I didn't see the lonely woman I once did. I saw someone older, gentler, wiser, someone who had carried love all her life and finally learned to set it down. Anne called that afternoon. Her voice was warm. "I'm glad we talked, Margaret," she said. "So am I, dear. It was long overdue." When we hung up, I smiled to myself. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt honest, like the past had finally settled into its place. And as I looked out at the roses blooming beneath the morning sun, I whispered one final confession, not to Anne, not to Thomas, but to myself. We both chose a husband, but in the end, we both became healers, not of him, but of ourselves.